Well, okay, Matt, what's the book about?
Well, let me take a minute of prerogative. What do you call it? What did y'all call in the Senate? Yielding one's time? Can you yield me a minute?
I just yielded you the entire hour.
I appreciate that. Just buy a book. That's all we ask. Let me say, first of all, it's terrific to be back at the Strand, which is really one of the great literary jewels of the country, actually, and where I spent a lot of my youth thumbing through books looking for ones I could afford, which I could do here. And also to say I'm very honored that Senator Kerrey would be here tonight. He is really one of the best public servants I've known and one of the most fun to be around, actually. You probably don't remember this. We met the first time on the 2000 campaign, Bill Bradley's campaign. I met my wife on that campaign as well, Ellen. She's actually jealous that I get to hang out with you tonight, which is not a common reaction one has to politicians. But
I've gone downhill since 2000.
Yeah. Haven't we all? And so I want to say, as I've been going around the country talking about this book, I have quoted Senator Kerrey at virtually every stop, and I've been all over now. I don't know if you realize that, because there's a quote in the book from when we spoke in 2012, somewhere in Nebraska, and Senator Kerrey said to me, "We're not the worst things we've ever done in our lives, and there's a tendency to think that we are." And that for me became an almost animating, as I reflected on that sentiment, which was kind of wise and compassionate and contextual, it became sort of an animating thought for me behind the book as I was writing it. It's also a good animating thought tonight, because if I say something idiotic that ruins my career in the next hour, perhaps it will, kick in on my behalf. So the book is about this moment in 1987 when politics and celebrity and tabloidism collided, and how this moment reverberated through the life of our politics and our country, but also how it reverberated through the life of this man and his family. It's a story, and it's been it is a little frustrating to write a book that's a story about politics and to find that it instantly becomes fodder for political analysis and is talked about, is debated as a political analysis, because everything now is like Nate Silver and the crystal ball and all that. But this is at heart. It's not a political story. It's a story, and it's a story of this human being and this moment in the country when all of these forces were churning, and would have created this change in any event. Gary Hart didn't create it. The Miami Herald didn't create it. No one action took it. If it hadn't been Hart, it would have been someone else, because this tipping point was coming, and it comes at that moment in '87.
By the way, the quote that you attributed to me was actually, I got it from Sister Regine, who's ministered to death row inmates, and when asked why did she do it, that was her response. So the story that, I campaigned for the Senate in '88. I made the decision to run in late 1987, and the Hart-Donna Rice thing blew up just before my campaign started in earnest. So I'm sort of, and I know Gary, and I supported Gary when he ran in '84, and would have supported him in '88 as well. So I have to disclose it to the audience. He's a friend, and I'm a bit biased as a consequence. So you can, diminish everything I say about him as a result of that bias. But I was of the impression, and many things that came out in your story were at odds with, and you had the facts and I didn't, were at odds with what I believe the story was. That I thought he got out of the race because of the photograph with Donna Rice sitting on his lap with the name Monkey Business in the background, and I thought he got out of the race as a consequence of the embarrassment about that. And I thought that was really the only factor in the whole story. And you tell something entirely different. So talk to me about discovering that the story was different, because I think you said in your book that it was different than what you thought it was.
Oh, absolutely. Because I was in college. And I don't know how many people here remember Hart. Are there probably people here who didn't even hear of him until now. Am I right? Right? Younger's pretty, so we just met. I still have no idea what you're talking about. This starts for me. So, I was a brand new writer at the New York Times Magazine in 2002, and you're always trolling for stories, and there was an item in the paper about Hart thinking about running for president again. And this seemed to me just crazy on a bunch of levels, but not least of which is why a man who was so disgraced would want to do this again, because or even think about it. Because I remember reading about him in my dorm room in college, and he had, I mean, it's hard for someone who doesn't remember that moment to understand the trajectory of that fall. I mean, he was the Hillary Clinton of his moment, and then he was gone. And not only gone, but stuck in that moment and disgraced, the butt of a national joke, Johnny Carson and folk singers, and the jokes that were going around the proverbial water cooler that doesn't even really exist anymore. I mean, he was in it. So, you know, I went and I met him and was just struck by him and what a compelling figure he was, especially, you know, I'd been covering politics for a while then, especially compared to some of the politicians who were coming into the process. He was just so self-evidently brilliant, had so many far-reaching ideas, was so well read, such a grasp of history, and was kind of a compelling guy with a great sense of humor, and even, you know, some of the charisma that had dimmed a little but was still there, and he was just so clearly wounded. And I wrote a story that he didn't like very much, and I don't blame him. But it kind of haunted me through the years, and I sort of started to connect it to what I was seeing in presidential politics. You know, connect it to candidates who looked at you like you were a hired assassin, who would not share any complex idea, who feared every word out of their mouth, you know, who just were so empty and cautious so much of the time. And I felt there was a connection, something missed. So I went back and started to look at this. You know, I kept talking to people about it. People thought I was insane. And I went back and started to look at the facts of the scandal. And it was remarkably different than what I remembered. And at first, when I would talk to people about it, they would insist I was wrong, that I was, you know, I had gotten my facts confused. And I thought maybe I had. Because everyone insisted that Hart, for instance, got up and said to the media, "Follow me around. Put a tail on me if you want." And the Miami Herald took him up on it. And what an idiot. He got caught doing exactly what he challenged them to find out. Well, that's not actually what happened. In truth, he gave the quote to a single magazine reporter. It was not published yet. It was sitting in a queue somewhere, being fought over with editors. And the Miami Herald gets the tip, the anonymous tip, takes it upon themselves to put the leading presidential candidate of the Democratic Party under surveillance at his home, ends up pinning him against a brick wall in the alleyway next to his house while he's wearing a white hoodie late at night, shouting at him, 4 reporters shouting at him, who's this woman in your house? Have you had sex with that woman? How long have you known that woman? And they only find out about this quote while they're doing all this. So that was not true. You know, it was. And
the website, the lead reporter, he now is running a journalism school. He still has a statement to the contrary on his website. Well, he's changed it now, right? Oh, Tom Fiedler, who was the lead reporter, he on his website at BU, where he's the dean, it said after reporters heard, you know, after Gary Hart challenged reporters, plural, to follow him around, Fiedler and the others took him up on it and took him down. And when the book came out, he changed the website. And has been, you know, changing it in different places ever since. And then, you know, everyone thinks the photograph, as you say, drove him out of the race. In fact, everyone thinks the photograph was on a boat, which makes it very illicit. If you've seen this photo, you can't miss this photo. If you Google, the boat was monkey business, and if you Google, you know, you cannot. This photo is unstoppable, unkillable. It will be attached to him forever. So you can't go 5 seconds on the web without seeing it. And everyone thinks the photo is very risque because it was taken on a boat. In fact, it was taken on a crowded pier. There were hundreds of people milling around, and it was near the boat. And it didn't come out publicly until 3 weeks after he was out of the race. And, you know, Hart's been tagged with this stuff. I mean, it's an interesting lesson for me in what my industry can do. Because Hart's been tagged with this stuff forever. He'll never get away. People will think that about the photo forever. I could write 10 books on it, you know. And so, you know, this stuff just sticks, and you can see how intensely frustrating and deflating that is for someone. But it's just not true. And the significance of it, you say, well, okay, so there was a boat, or the quote came this week or the week after, like, so what? Well, the so what is that this was a moment where a lot of rules around politics and political journalism changed, where a lot of boundaries were rewritten. And because we always assumed that Hart rewrote them, he challenged us to do it. He acted like an idiot. He got caught on this boat, right? It wasn't our problem.
he had invited all of us into his bedroom and thereby invited us into the bedroom of every politician. And I think he really got blamed for this in the public mind. I think that was part of the disgrace was, you changed our politics for the worse. And the reality is we made that decision. The Miami Herald made that decision. My industry made that decision. We never revisited it. We debated it for a very short time and basically settled out on the idea that absent this guy, everything would have gone on the way it was going. And it's a wrong interpretation of what was happening in that moment.
Yeah, so it seems to me there's a commercial side to this as well. Both there appears to be strong motivation on the part of the Miami Herald to break this story, and strong motivation on the Washington Post part to get in the game in some fashion. It was quite interesting that the Post made a considerable effort to make sure the Miami Herald didn't get a Pulitzer for it. But they were hunting, and the sort of the energy at the time was, I want to be Bob Woodward, right? And how did it come that, because I do remember at the time, and you talk about it very well in the book, that rather than saying we're trying to get the Pulitzer, rather than saying I hope you understand it's just business, I'm selling newspapers, they made it about his character.
Yes.
So, in the book, you make a pretty compelling case that it was not about character.
Well, I think you have to. One of the things I really try to do in the book is wrestle with the complexities of what was in people's minds, because it's too easy to caricature. And Watergate was interesting. I mean, Watergate had a couple of. Watergate's a huge thing for this, and this doesn't happen without Watergate and maybe Vietnam before it. And the one story about Watergate is that all of these journalists were now coming in who had gone to journalism school and decided to get in the business post-Watergate. They're just getting onto the campaign buses and planes in 1984 and 1988. And they really do want to be Woodward and Bernstein. I mean, this is a whole new kind of fame. And I think it's hard to overstate the importance of All the President's Men. I mean, All the President's Men, the movie, was more important in a sense in journalism than Nixon's resignation or the book. Because all of a sudden, journalists were movie heroes at a moment when that meant something, and everyone remembers Ben Bradley, who died this week. Everyone thought Jason Robards died this week. In their mind, that's who they see. So there is a huge motivation to find the scandal, to take someone down, because that is suddenly the grandest form of imitation in journalism. But the other part of it is that I kind of came to as I was working on the book, and it's also important, is that it was a hugely embarrassing moment for political journalism, because who were Woodward and Bernstein? They were a couple of cops reporters who caught a cop story and followed it to its end. The entire political press corps, which had known Richard Nixon at that point for 20 plus years, just let him sail through. I mean, it turned out a guy of dubious moral character, instability emotionally, paranoid, lying. They just let it go, and they missed it. And so I think it was, there was a mindset among journalists now covering politics. Not only did they want to be famous and successful, but they didn't want to let this happen again, right? And they didn't want to be caught in the position of judging that a lie wasn't relevant and then finding out that it was because it illuminated something deeper about your character. So I think there is a genuine desire to ferret out flawed character, combined with this instinct for fame, and what we end up doing, I think the moment was very uncomfortable for a lot of journalists. It was interesting to go back and interview them, and even Jack Germont, before he died, I sat down with, and you hear the conflict. Germont said, well, I could never have done what Fiedler did, and I could never do what Paul Taylor did, which is another piece of the story we can talk about, because Taylor is the one from the Washington Post. And then in the next breath, but if Gary Hart's going to go screwing every woman down the street, then he walking down the street, then he doesn't deserve to be president. There was this really difficult balancing act among journalists that they never really resolved. And I think we did erect a series of rationales in my business to justify what we had done. And I grew up in this moment, right? So I get into political journalism, and I've used it all. I used all of these rationales. It's not the sex, it's the lie. If he'll lie to his wife, he'll lie to anybody, which of course we know history just proves to be a flat-out fallacy, right? And and the idea that we're sort of caught in this current, we're just moving downstream, and the story's out there, and all we can do is follow it, right? Everybody else is doing it, and we have to do it. And this is what Bradley says. Bradley's such a fascinating character in the book. Because he runs the gamut really from Kennedy, whom he really protected. I think there's no other way to get to
death. Believed that Kennedy never fooled around on his wife, right?
Well, he says, at the very least, he's guilty of not wanting to know. What he knew, he said he didn't know.
I have no idea what you just said. You do too many negatives in the
Well,
sentence.
I'm saying, at the very least, he turned a blind eye. But, he probably knew more than that because his sister-in-law had an affair with Kennedy. I'm
taking the correct response to what you just said is duh. Of course he knew.
Right, probably. But I'm going to give him, he's Ben Bradley, and I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. And then he comes to Watergate, where he's, the hero of Watergate. And then to this moment in Hart, which I think is a very ignoble moment, where he basically says, I go back to this interview with David Frost afterward, this long-forgotten interview, where he basically says, look, we don't control this anymore. Like, we just have to cover the story, because if you don't, everybody else does, and then everybody wants to know why you're not covering it. We don't control it anymore. And I think this is the beginning of the moment where the big institutional media feel they no longer have the prerogative to be gatekeepers, and so to get to your point, I think we do erect all of these rationales, and I'm really asking if we should revisit them because they don't make sense.
Well, I don't know that you can stop, because it's marketable. I mean, I watched on the back seat of the taxi cab the other day, Jimmy Kimmel going on the street asking people who Joe Biden was, and nobody knew who he was.
They probably interviewed 100 people and got 13.
There shouldn't be 13 people that don't know who Joe Biden is, right? So,
I'm sorry, Joe.
Right. Right. I'm just saying that there is a celebrity culture today that's the market, and it's. Kim Kardashian can get $250,000. If she was here tonight, Strand would pay her $250,000, and there'd be a line halfway around the block. So I'm just saying that there is a market here, and there's a market for these stories, and it's a cautionary tale for me, for citizens who are getting these stories. Not to mention what you put it on in a nice way. I would say the corruption of a very distinguished journalist who basically said what we heard in Godfather 2, I hope you understand, it's just business. So it does seem to me that there's a cautionary tale here because the technology's only gotten worse. I mean, you've highlighted in your book, I think, something very important, which is the power of the facts. We wouldn't have seen that photograph were it not for that. We wouldn't have seen the distribution of the Miami Herald story were it not for the facts. And the facts allowed all of us to know what was going on rather quickly. And then Hart shows up in his place in Colorado, and there's a gazillion members of the press there with satellite cameras. Right. And it's only gotten worse, it seems to me, since 1987.
Well, the first thing I would say is in fairness to those journalists, I think they did feel they had I think they felt at the time they had an actual interest in treating candidates differently than they've been treated before. I mean, Tom Fiedler writes in Politico a few weeks ago, the day the book comes out, Fiedler writes a piece in Politico, which I then responded to eventually, and he says, the real question is he's kind of all over the place, but he says, the real question is why didn't we ask these same questions about sex to Roosevelt and Kennedy and Johnson? To which my response was, well, I guess we could, and they could lie too, and then we could declare them unfit morally, and we could figure out a different way through the Great Depression and World War II and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Great Society, and we can have 25 terms of the Carter administration, and that might be great. But I think I'll opt for history as it was. But so I do think there's some conviction there. I don't know that I would call it outright corruption.
No, I don't. I'm not saying there's not conviction. The Sister Pagine remark is a good one to remember in this conversation. I'm not saying that because a member of the press does something just for money, just to get their own names in lights, that makes them a bad person in all cases. But I'm just saying that I was struck by that motivation in the story. Because it unquestionably, the Taylor story is more interesting. He seemed to have been traumatized by it. Because didn't he quit? Didn't he basically he was a rising star at the time.
He was. So Taylor is the lead reporter for the Washington Post. He's the heir apparent to David Broder. He's going to inherit the greatest political franchise in the country. And Taylor has an interesting relationship with Hart. He knows him. He feels condescended to, because Hart, I think it's fair to say, could make you feel condescended to if he didn't think you were on top of your game. And he's appalled at Hart's sort of attack on the media once the Herald story runs. And then the Post has evidence of what they say is another affair. I mean, Hart's been twice separated from his wife already. He's spent years dating around Washington, so it wasn't especially hard to find another woman who he'd been seeing. And Taylor decides he's going to confront him. And what I really think was going on, I talk about this in the book, is Taylor doesn't say this, but I think he was a serious journalist, and he did not see himself writing a story about an affair. But he could see himself writing a story about hypocrisy. And the problem was that Hart had never actually claimed to be faithful to his wife. Hart had refused to answer the question. So it's hard to catch him on hypocrisy unless he says he's been faithful to his wife. So Taylor goes to this news conference in New Hampshire, packed, sweat-soaked news conference, of the kind we're used to today, but they were not then. Hundreds of reporters, and there's literally an aide on all fours, sitting between Hart to keep him from getting toppled over by the reporters, because nobody has any clue about crowd control at this point for this kind of thing. It's brand new, and tabloid press has never covered politics before now. And Taylor very, very quietly, in a very tense exchange, gets his attention. Hart's really kind of firing on all cylinders, and Taylor says to him, "Senator, you said you're I'd like to ask you a few questions," which I don't know how you get away with that in a news conference, but I guess it was a different time. And he says, do you consider yourself a moral leader? And Hart says, yes. And he says, do you consider adultery immoral? Hart says, I suppose so. And Taylor says, well, Senator, have you ever committed adultery? Which no presidential candidate had ever heard to that time. The people who were in the room remember it still. It was a really shocking moment for them. In fact, I had someone come up to me at a reading a couple of weeks ago and said I was in that room. And she said I remember every second of it. It was unbelievable. And Hart just sits flummoxed. He's looking out at the reporters as I'm looking out at you, and he's thinking to himself, all these reporters were on his plane in 1984, and he knows who had affairs with who and who was married. And they're staring at him with what he remembers to be these particularly angry, demanding faces, and he's thinking, how dare you? And all his resolve kind of, flutters away at that point, and he basically just kind of says, I don't think that's a fair question. His campaign is over. He's done in 24 hours. But
after Bradley calls and says we're going to run a story.
Right. Then they say, then that night they say, by the way, we're going to run this story.
His daughter's being staked out. His
daughter's staked out. A woman writes him a note and says, if they come to my door, I'm going to kill myself. And I think that had a real impact on him. I mean, he did tell all of his aides. I don't know that it's just excuses after the fact. He did tell a lot of his aides at that point, I don't want these other women dragged through the papers for the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks or however long it's going to be. He says to his press secretary, this is never going to end, is it? And his press secretary says, I guess you'd know that better than I would, Senator. And, he says, well, let's go home. But the thing about the market is, talk to me about a little bit. Finish out Taylor, because he's really interesting to me, and I don't quite get it in the book. He's no longer a journalist. Right. He went to work for Pew. I don't get it either. I mean, I'll be honest. I'm honest in the book. I think he had to be traumatized. Everybody who knows Paul Taylor says he was traumatized and left the business because of this, except for Paul Taylor, who insists that all must be right. What does he know? Yeah, right. I swear there was a picture of him on a boat. He says he left for all these other reasons, but he's clearly deeply conflicted about this, and he didn't really want to sit down to give the interview. And when he did, he was a little, I don't remember anything. Whatever I wrote about it at the time is pretty much it. There's an extraordinary thing in the week after. He takes, imagine this for a political reporter who, at the top of his game, is about to inherit this political franchise, very respected. He's a big personality. I can put myself easily in his shoes as someone who's covered politics at a high level. He's getting hammered on the editorial pages around the country, just hammered for this. And in that week afterward, he actually takes the extraordinary step of writing a letter to the New York Times, his competitor, and saying, I'm the guy you keep beating on who asked the question, and let me tell you why I did it. But Taylor publicly digs in right from the start. I did what I had. Taylor's feeling, even now, when I talked to him, his feeling was, the fire alarm goes off and you cover the fire. And I was in the moment, and he says to me, quite literally, I agree with you. It's a terrible thing. We should respect more private boundaries, but shit happens, and there I was. And what he says is, if I could have chosen my 15 minutes, I wish this wasn't it.
But it was interesting in some ways. his fate and Hart's fate are identical.
They are, and they're intertwined. It is, and this is part, so many things about this story were so compelling to me and why I felt I had to tell it, despite the fact that people kept saying, Gary Hart, really? And one of them is this interplay, because it affects the trajectory of all the people around it, but none more profoundly as a counterpart to Hart than Taylor. They never talk again. He never talks to any of these guys again. They both end up seared by it in their own way, and pursuing completely different. They collide in this moment, and their lives are forever changed, and they end up going down completely different paths, and both being, I think, a little tormented and a little disappointed and frustrated. And that's me putting words in Taylor's mouth, because if he's sitting here, he'd say, I'm not disappointed and frustrated, I'm just fine. But there are the quotes and the body language and the testimonials from people who know him, and I think it's fair to say that they both sort of suffered some consequence of this. He became, in a way that Hart became frozen as the guy who got caught, Taylor becomes frozen as the guy who asked the question. And I would posit that if he could go back and do it again, he would do it differently. Fiedler, on the other hand, becomes editorial page editor of the Miami Herald, executive editor of the Miami Herald, wins a Pulitzer Prize, retires, serves a fellowship at Harvard, runs the BU School of Journalism, and his website's wrong. So
No.
There's a different.
His website lied. Those are words. Those are his words.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting,
I don't know Fiedler, but I'm just saying, if I put those words up on my website and they were incorrect, you'd say I lied.
Yeah. Well, those interestingly, I will tell you, those reporters have now had a recovered memory, sort of change of heart, and now there's intimation that maybe they saw the quote a day earlier, even though it didn't matter, but it kind of mattered. And this is disturbing to me, because the story has been consistent for 27 years. I didn't rewrite the story. People just misremembered it. The Miami Herald wrote their own reconstruction 3 days after the event. Every one of those, all three of the lead reporters, Fiedler at the top, wrote their own reconstruction, and were very clear that they saw that quote on Saturday, a day after they'd commenced their stakeout, and had no idea he challenged anybody. And here we are 30 years on. They've never
debating it.
Well, all of a sudden, there's like a recovered, I think I remember seeing that quote a day earlier.
Not possible.
I don't believe it's possible, no.
Right. So if you
and I think they should own the consequences.
You've been on the road, so you probably haven't had a chance to, and you've got young kids as well, so you probably haven't seen Birdman. I
have not seen Birdman. I've seen the ads.
Right.
Does that count?
No, that doesn't count. Well, it may count for something, but there's a scene in Birdman where he, in a bar, is told there's the reporter from the New York Times that's going to review your play tomorrow night, and she basically says, I'm going to destroy you. I haven't seen the play yet, but I'm going to destroy you. And as it turns out, she doesn't. It turns out she likes the play, in part because he actually does try to kill himself on stage, and she sort of liked that. And but there's a scene, very much like, have you seen the movie Chef?
I haven't. No, I just got that one in the mail through the WGA.
Right. So in Chef, there's another scene where he also is taking on a critic. And I'm not suggesting to you that I have similar sentiments towards the press.
Right.
But I do think there's something about the press that needs to be drawn out, particularly in light of the importance of the press. Because I happen to believe that a free and open press is enormously important. Without it, you don't have a democracy. And I give you lots of examples where not for a free and open press, reporting based upon what they think is the truth, bad decisions get made. And the opposite is also the case. So what happened with Hart? I mean, there was another story that you told in there, and I remember the word being applied to Gary, but I never quite understood why. The press at the time were saying, Hart's weird. He's weird. And that word, he got belled with that word. And as I understand it, he got belled with that word because he read Kierkegaard and he read Kant. And you think, what the hell would they said about Jefferson and Madison? Those guys read philosophers as well. How else would they come up with we hold these truths to be self-evident? It wasn't polling data that produced that conclusion. So what was it about Hart that caused the press to say he was weird?
It's a great question. I wrestled with it a lot, because you're time traveling when you do a book like this, which is hard in its own way. I mean, in a way, it's the first thing I've done in such a long form where you don't have a moving target every day, right? And somebody says, get on a plane now, and you go. But going back in time is hard because you can't really get in people's heads and they remember things differently. And there was all this, this buzz. I mean, part of this is driven by the idea that something about Hart is off. He's hiding something. And then you look at the evidence for this and it strikes you, I think it'll strike you. It struck me as being intensely silly. Like, his birth certificate said he was 49, but he'd said he was born the year earlier or the year later, right? I can't remember. It's so insignificant. Or his signature changed from when he was 18 years old. And he changed his name, right? That's the other one. He changed it. The family's name was Hart Pence, and they all changed it to Hart. And this was taken as evidence of, very bizarre behavior. I think, and
By the way,
really,
I'd never heard that story told about him going home and how wonderful his family was. He was, in that way,
talked about
politically weird. Because everybody talks about their family if there's something positive to be told. And he had something really positive to be told and didn't tell it.
Yeah, well, maybe less weird then than now. But I think he was, look, there's no question. What was going on pretty clearly is, yes, this guy who'd grown up in the Nazarene church and gone to Bible college and was jug-eared and awkward and too smart for his little hometown, basically ends up at Yale and ends up swept into the social currents of the 1960s and kind of wants to reinvent himself, which is not, in the 1960s, which is not at all unusual, right? But here's what I think was going on, in my best estimation, after looking at this, which is, Hart put himself in a little bit of a box. Right? He's a little bit to blame for this. He set himself up as, he's in different ways, he set himself up as the harbinger of the 60s generation. He's going to lead the boomers into power. It's their moment. You still have Reagan as president, who's as old as Moses, and you got Tip O'Neill just behind him. And the boomers are knocking on every other door. They're taking over entertainment. They're taking over literature. They're taking over the culture, and they want politics. And here's Hart, the first guy at the door. The problem is that Hart's actually born in 1936. The boom begins in 1946.
Really interesting fact.
Yeah. And that's a big 10 years. Like some 10 years in American life are not that big a deal.
But he wasn't them.
He looks like them. He holds himself out as them. But in reality, when he goes on TV, he doesn't say to Ted Koppel, Ted, it's good to be with you, like all the smart new young reporters. He says, hello, Mr. Koppel, and that seems very weird, right? He doesn't listen to the same music. He doesn't emote. You can't get the guy. He'll drink with the older reporters, but he doesn't like the younger reporters who are too familiar and personal. He's from post-Depression Kansas. That's a different deal. He doesn't like talking to these guys he doesn't know about his marriage or his family, right? He doesn't share that information with them, even though they know a lot about what he's up to. He doesn't like to talk about his feelings. I think to them he seemed strange because he looked and was supposed to be like them, but he acted like their dad.
Tell the mountain lion story.
And the which story?
The mountain lion story.
Yeah. Oh, the mountain lion. I was going to open the book with the mountain lion, and I did. I wrote 3,000 words, and my wife, Ellen, who's probably the best editor I know, told me it didn't work and I should not do it. So I tore it up and started again, and then put the mountain lion in that chapter, which is my favorite chapter of the book, which is about the exile years in Colorado. These years spent in isolation. But Hart goes out one day. He told me this story probably 3 separate times over the years, and from the time I first met him till later when I was working on the book. And the story is that he comes home one day from his regular Sunday trip to get the New York Times, and his dogs go crazy, and one of them flies up the sheer mountain behind the house, the cabin in Colorado, and Hart.
And he's got a very close relationship with his dogs. He loves his dogs.
Yes, there's an intense relationship with the dogs. So it really is, because these years in exile are very tough, and the bond with pets is very strong. He goes up, he chases the dog. He's worried, and he's a very hardy guy. I mean, he drove railroad spikes in the 90-degree heat when he was a kid, so he's still very tough. And he goes up the hill, and he comes over the ridge, basically expecting to see something terrible because he can't hear his dog anymore. And what he finds is this huge mountain lion in a tree staring at him, and all his training tells him what to do is you don't make eye contact, and you don't you sort of make yourself large, and things I would never know, and I would be eaten in about 12 seconds by a mountain lion. But he stares into the mountain lion's eyes. He's transfixed, and what seems to him like minutes, and it's probably seconds, and the mountain lion ultimately just kind of bounds and goes away. And Hart keeps telling this story, and he gets very teary when he tells it. So I finally, what happened was, after him telling me the story several times and I was getting ready to write, I called him one day, which I didn't do very often. I tended to talk to him in person because he's not an emotive person, and you get him on the phone and it's not quite the same thing. And I called him up and I said, you told me this damn story like 3 times. What's going on? Why? And we kind of went round and round, and he finally said to me on the phone that day, I guess it made me feel, he said it was almost like a religious experience. And I said, why? And he said, because it felt like there was some purpose left for me. I could have died right there, but I didn't. And there was something more for me to do. And then it sort of clicked for me in a very deep way that, he thought he had a lot of emotions in all these years after the scandal, but I think one of the overriding emotions was that he was done, was that he'd had his moment, and there was nothing more he could contribute, nothing more he'd be allowed to contribute. And something, he's a spiritual man, and something about that experience, made him feel, and forever after, when he would talk about it, made him feel as if there was another turn for him in the road.
Just so you know, I emailed him after I read the book and said his interpretation of that moment was completely wrong. Completely wrong. Yeah. What I said to him is, you have to behave, you should have behaved in '87, and you can behave now as you behave with that lion. You were in New Hampshire with the press, there was the lion.
But
there are times when if you run, it's the absolute wrong response. And he's ran away since 1987.
He really sees it obviously very differently.
I know,
because I pressed him on this, and other people do too. And his feeling is, being the first in that situation, you have no idea what it was like. He says, I couldn't move, I couldn't express myself. I was seeing my family torn apart. I was seeing women I knew were going to be torn apart.
I'm sympathetic. I'm not criticizing him for what he did in '87.
Right.
I'm saying your interpretation that life has more meaning. Maybe I can do something in life. I say, okay, big deal. The only way your life is going to have meaning is if you behave with the lion as you behave then with the lion, right? That's what you have to do. And we all have lions out there.
Well, why didn't you tell him that sometime before?
Well, it didn't occur to me. I didn't know the lion story. And I was, what I'm saying is that I care deeply about Gary, and I think your book in many ways has liberated him. Because it's put out a different story. And I'm not sure that, first of all, I'm not sure many people remember the story at all. And I think your story has given Gary, it's given Gary something that he really needed, which is permission to talk again and travel east again.
Well, I hope so. And as you know, I think, he was just named, just this week, he was named Secretary Kerry's special envoy to Northern Ireland, which is something, and he was actually the first presidential candidate, I think, to call for all parties to sit down and share power and talk in Northern Ireland, and it's a very big reentry for him. He's not had an assignment like that. But I've not been apologetic about this, and maybe I'm sure it just adds to the things some of my colleagues might not like, although I think the book has really resonated with younger colleagues of mine. But, there's a lot of things you want to do when you write a book, and I want to move people, and I want it to get widely read. But I also, if at the end of the day, the effect is that people remember Gary Hart a little bit differently. I didn't write the book for him, and he knows that. He called me up halfway through, and he said, "Hey, I just realized," he said, "this book isn't about me; it's about you." And in some ways, that's true. He's prescient as always. But look, at the end of the day, Gary Hart, I hope he lives a long time and does a lot more in public service, but someday they're going to write his obituary, and that first paragraph of that obituary is almost certainly going to be Gary Hart, whose presidential ambitions were undone, ... And if that can be remembered with some greater context, if his contribution and his experience can be remembered in some different way, then I'll feel good about that.
What's the last word of your book, and what two people does that word reference?
I can't tell people that, and then it just ruins all the suspense.
They're still by the
I'm willing to tell them that Gary Hart doesn't become president, but beyond that, the last word of the book is character. And we were talking about this. I do think that both Donna Rice and Gary Hart, I think it's just incontrovertible that they showed a strong measure of character in the years after, and so it makes you question your suppositions about what we do. We drive people away for their lack of character, but character is forged over a lifetime, and it's forged in the context of your behavior and a totality of experiences in the public record. And the question I often leave people with, I ask about, and we were talking about this before, is, well, I'll ask you what character is, and is it, because this is what I wrestled with in doing the book, is it the guy who says, I've drawn a line, I'm not telling you more than that, I'm going home, I will sit there for 25 years and write my books and try to and get my PhD and stay in isolation if I have to, but I'm not dragging my family through it. I'm not groveling for your forgiveness. I'm not doing the Oprah. I'm not doing the tell-all memoir. I'm not divulging the details of my private life, because I don't believe that's what a leader should do. Or is character in a leader the person who says, how soon can you book me on 60 Minutes? I got to bring my wife on. I got to shed a tear while I'm there in a mode. I got to say anything. I got to lie about the other affairs I've had. I've got to do whatever I have to do to get the prize, because I know I belong in office. And if I have to tell a few lies to get there, or disgrace or demean myself, or subject my family to any level of invasiveness or scrutiny, and that's what I have to do. I mean, I would submit to you that for most of the life of the country, leadership and conviction were associated with the first line of behavior. And maybe it doesn't fit in the modern culture, but I ask you, at a moment of transformational, wrenching change, when someone has to tell you things that aren't true, and someone has to tell you things that aren't cheerful to hear. Someone has to tell you difficult truths, and by the way, Bob Kerrey was a guy who did that routinely in Washington. Which person is going to do that? And is there a reason that this event and this change in our culture coincides with a period of time where we have utterly failed to meet the realities of our moment, to admit the difficulties, or make the adjustments required, even when it costs us some measure of pain? And I think there is.
Well, I'm going to ask one more question, then I think I should let people in the audience ask questions.
They don't have any questions.
That's not as good as the one.
Read the book and all get answered.
So. I referenced Birdman and Chef earlier, so bless you. So in both of these, there's this wonderful, I love scenes in stories, and so there's two scenes that are very, very similar. In Birdman, he lets it all out, talking to a critic, and he basically says, I best be careful of my language. I'm drawing up one word that I guess I can't say. So he says, what do you know? What do you do? You're a critic. What do you know?
Every director's dream.
Right. So, and likewise in Chef, this food critic had trashed him. And there's this beautiful scene where he erupts in the restaurant. He trashes this critic. And all of us who've been in, there is this sort of weird relationship between the press and the politicians. But I would argue, and I would ask you whether or not you agree with it, and if not, say why not, and if so, say why. I believe the quality of journalism today is better than it was in 1987.
Oh yeah, I agree with that. I think there's access to more and better and more varied forms of journalism, particularly in political journalism, than there's ever been. I think a new generation is looking at things differently. I think it's I think we have a more varied media, and in many ways a better media and a deeper and more contextual media. And I'm very proud of the body of work I did at the New York Times Magazine. Proud of what I'm doing with Yahoo with all.
Even though they didn't give you health benefits.
Well, they finally came around on that in the end. I know that always shocked you. Yeah. But I found the health
hired him as independent contractors.
The health benefits weren't actually worth it.
And on their editorial page, they were blasting any business that did the same.
Yeah.
It was, talk about hypocrisy.
No, my kids had to raise themselves for the first few years because of that. But so we have that. It's just that there's less to cover. Right? It's not that political journalism isn't varied or strong. It's just that we've now created, in my view, and I've done this for a while now, a very dysfunctional dynamic where they don't want to talk to us, they don't want to know us, they're afraid to share anything resembling an idea, and certainly not with nuance. And you can only do so much illuminating of what people intend to do with the country and how they plan to meet those challenges I just talked about if there's no conversation there. And so I think there's some very good journalism, and I think there's some very good public servants, but I think there's an utter dysfunction and disconnect in the dialogue between them, and in the picture, how full a picture we're able to then present to the public, and how informed a public we're able to foster. And that disheartens me. When I started doing political journalism, well, not even that, but when I started the New York Times Magazine 12 years ago, we were writing magazine stories, I would say I spent 25% of my time, 20% of my time just setting up access, getting people comfortable with the idea I was going to be around, getting the story. By the time I left, and it was not incidental to my leaving, although there were a lot of reasons, by the time I stopped doing that kind of work a year ago, I was probably doing 60% of my time cajoling, threatening, steamrolling, going ahead with the story anyway, and then doubling back, calling people's friends to call their friends to tell them that I was actually going to be interested in substance, getting people to look at my body of work. It was exhausting, and I was in a different place in the business, so probably that contributes to it in some way. But I think every political writer would tell you the same thing. I think it's why it resonates with so many of the younger political writers now, the book, because we understand, I think they understand intrinsically that something's wrong, that we sell the public a bill of goods. We're selling you a lie, right? I talk about this in the first chapter. We tell you, we go on cable TV all day long. I don't, but let me speak in the royal industry. We go on cable TV all day long, and we sell you the idea that we know everything these people are thinking. Hillary Clinton's going to run. Here's what Hillary Clinton's going to run. Oh, she's just doing this, she's doing that. And then, people start to say, well, you know more than you really are letting on. You're protecting your sources, your cozy relationships, your cocktail parties, all this kind of stuff. It's just such a lie. The truth is, we don't know anything. We don't know anything you don't know. We don't go to parties. We don't go to dinners. Hillary Clinton has never sat down for me for a long interview. I've talked to her on the phone and in person a couple of times, but nothing that I would consider substantive. They're scared to death of us. And it's not healthy, and the lie isn't ennobling.
Questions?
Well, on that cheerful note, you do the...
All right. I'll come to you next. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, obviously this incident sort of opens up the door, right, in a lot of ways. But if you trace that to where we are today, there's a lot more, like creek versus, wide open, one might say, right? Talk about are there 2 or 3 other points between then and now that sort of get that door open more and more, sort of trace the path from that to where we are now.
Oh yeah, because it starts with sex, but it's not just sex, right? It's because what happens is almost instantly. I mean instantly, like almost within weeks, right? The first thing that occurs, this is the very beginning of the campaign industry, right? Richard Kramer wrote about this beautifully in What It Takes. 88 is like the beginning of the industry that grows up around television and politics. It really becomes a big money business. And, before James Carville arrives in 92 to make it, just full on celebrity. And right within the first thing that occurs to everybody in the business is, hey, this is bad for our candidate's going to get caught doing something, and this can take you down in an instant. But the second thing that occurs to them very quickly on is, oh, but wait a minute, if we can turn the torpedo toward our opponent, right? You could be 20 points down in the polls. You could be running against somebody who could never lose, but you can take them down. If you can get to their character, you can take them down pretty quickly. So within weeks of that event, Richard Celeste, who was a star governor of Ohio, is basically out of contention forever because of his own affairs. And then you have Joe Biden, right? Poor Joe Biden, who no one has ever heard of. But Joe Biden, but also unfortunate because, people forget he was nearly ruined in that moment. And because one time, as far as we know, one time in Iowa, he told a story that he'd been crediting over and over and over to someone else, Neil Kinnock in England. And he just forgot the credit, which all politicians do late at night when you're tired and you've told 12 stories. And I probably do it in the book tour, right? That he just left out the credit. And somebody on the Dukakis campaign leaks the tape to Maureen Dowd, and within a week, amid a furor, Joe Biden is out of the presidential race and really is tainted for years afterward. Rehabilitates himself. But so that's a huge moment. Newt Gingrich's takedown of Jim Wright is a huge moment. No, never has a Speaker of the House been forced to resign, and over something so silly as like book royalties. I'm personally in favor of people making all the money off books they can. I don't care what they do. But basically that's Gingrich. He knows he can't beat Jim Wright at the ballot box, but Gingrich figures out faster than anybody that this is a whole new way of doing warfare. John Tower is another huge thing that happens in the years that right. Tower's the first cabinet nominee to be submitted to the Senate to be rejected, by the Senate for basically innuendo about a raucous, wild private life, which was probably, you would know better than I, was probably not far off the truth, but until that moment had never really been disqualifying in public life. So, there are steps, that's a few, but there are steps, and then, of course, Monica Lewinsky and impeachment. And look, I want to be really clear about something. I'm not saying that all of these should have been off-limits stories. I don't think Clinton's offenses were impeachable necessarily. I certainly think they were news. I think John Edwards' story was news and impeached his credibility in a significant way that I don't think I could come back from. I think, I wrestle with what is news and what isn't. I ultimately think it just comes down to judgment and context. And what we've really lost as a business is context. It's more about report the news, but report it in the context of the totality of the public record. Rick Hertzberg is writing in the New Republic in 1987. And he says, before he got to the New Yorker, and in that week, he writes what I think is a very courageous and prescient story, and he says, if Gary Hart's a liar, surely there's evidence in the public record. Let someone produce it.
The first stoning.
Yes, he called it the first stoning by the mullahs of a presidential candidate. Right. But he really just calls out the lie about character. He says, where's the evidence of lies? No one produced it then or later, because did Hart lie to his constituents? No. Did he lie to his colleagues? No. Did he duck tough votes? Did he take contributors' money in exchange for votes? All the things that are also part of a politician's character. And so really, I think it's that totality that's just utterly missing.
Yeah, I think in addition, since '87, the big change for me that I've witnessed is the rise of importance of the undecided voter. So let's say you and I are the opposite politically. Going into the presidential election in 2016, approximately 110 million people will vote. Of those 110, 8 million will be undecided 1 week out. It's the same way in probably 12, 15 close Senate races right now. And let's say, just for the sake of the argument, I don't want to offend you by attributing to you positions that you don't hold. Let's say you want abortion to be illegal, I want it to be legal. Right? You're against marriage equality. I'm for it. I'm going to raise the minimum wage. You don't. I believe the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. You think it's 6,000 years old.
What is wrong with that guy?
No. But that's what we will have in 2016. We will have two candidates who are starkly different, and that's what we have in 10 or 12 Senate races across the country. But there are 6 to 7% undecided voters who are, strictly speaking, monstrously uninformed, not to know the difference between the two candidates. And they become the most important voters in America. That's where all the money is getting spent. Whether it's in Iowa between Tom Strayer and the Koch brothers, it doesn't really matter. They're going after the undecided voters. With data, they can find out which phrases they like, which phrases turn them, what really moves them, what will modify them, what will get them to possibly vote for the right candidate. And they become more and more and more important. And as a consequence, the candidates are afraid to say something that would offend that undecided voter. Not the one who's already figured out that my views and your views are so different. I mean, it shouldn't be that difficult to figure out who you're going to vote for based upon your own views. But that's not why I'm going to vote for you. So I think the rise of the undecided voter since 1997 and the money that's being spent, I mean, your vote and my vote are probably irrelevant in the campaign. What matters is those people who describe themselves undecided a week before the election.
And one more.
First of all, I also recall about Paul Terry. Wasn't even part of a movement to make TV free for ads. I thought that was his claim to fame. But am I not right?
Pew, he is.
Yeah, he did. He did
But
go
that's not
to
my
do
question.
campaign reform.
But that's
later,
not my
Okay.
question. And before you answer
Was technically a question, but
well, it's a comment. And before you answer it, I want to recall a quote that Mr. Kerrey made at the time. How do you explain the survival and success of Bill Clinton? And I want to recall a quote that you made during the primary when you ran. Remember, you ran for president against Bill Clinton.
I have no memory of that.
In 1992. And I think
let me use Bill Clinton's language. To the best of my recollection, I was nowhere near Mobile that night.
You were pulling out of the race at the time, and you said that the media would crush Bill Clinton like a warm peanut. I don't. Do you remember
Yes.
that quote?
Yes.
And how do you explain Bill Clinton's success and
So, but
survival?
do you mind if I correct the presumption?
Crushed easier than cold.
No. What happened was I went to Atlanta, Georgia, shortly after the New Hampshire primary. I finished third in New Hampshire primary. It wasn't a question of am I going to get off the dance floor. The only question was how. I was not going to win. As far as I was, you're not going to get the Democratic nomination if you finish third. So I'm in Georgia for the first time since I went through airborne school and ranger school in the Army. I was in the Navy, but they sent us to those schools. And at airborne school, I don't know if you've known any David Rabe's play. He had a play called Streamers. And there was a character in there by the name of Carlisle. And what I saw in airborne school, I told Emory University students, was that these kids had no privilege whatsoever. They were drafted. They were, I don't know, God knows why they were at airborne school. And most of them were on their way to Vietnam. And I would say a significant fraction of them were probably dead or injured as a consequence. And a man came up after I'd give that speech. And so I said to them, understand that you've got a privilege. And when you have a privilege, you've got to make the most of it. That was the speech. So I'm out of the race, basically. And afterwards, a man came up and said, I was one of your drill instructors. And I saw the same thing. There were way too many unqualified African-American men in that program. And it turns out they had a program called a T-100 where they basically swept the streets clean of very poor black men in 1968. 1967 actually is when it went into effect. And so I'm just enraged with this news. I think, Jesus, what a fucked up country we got. That's how I was thinking at the time. That was the word I was going to use earlier. So I go into the press conference, and the first question was, today Bill Clinton said that he wanted to join the Army, but he couldn't join the Army because he had asthma. Now, I had terrible childhood asthma and was hospitalized almost every fall from it. And so my response was, oh, Jesus, if he gets a nomination in the Democratic Party, the Republicans, it was, no one understands Georgia. So I had to use a Georgia expression. I said they would open him up like a soft shell peanut. Never said crushed. I said they'd open him up like a soft shell peanut. And unfortunately, that statement was used it was used actually against me for raising the Vietnam War in the debate, in the campaign. And I never did. I never considered it to be disqualifying because he never served in the service and never went to Vietnam. All things being equal at the time was probably a pretty good judgment. But because I made that statement, I got sort of tagged with having raised the Vietnam War and his non-participation in it during the campaign. That wasn't your question either, was it? But you misquoted me, and I couldn't resist.
It's a pretty good story, though.
Anyway,
Yeah, I will very quickly. I mean, the difference between Bill Clinton and there's an interpretation that some reporters use that is charitable to themselves, which is to say, the country works through this stuff. So Hart was first, and then Clinton comes along. By then, the country's decided adultery is just not that big a deal. So see, it all works out okay, and the public makes good decisions. That's not what happened, actually. The difference between Hart and Clinton has nothing to do with intellect or vision, because Clinton took a lot of his vision from Hart, and they're both giant intellects. Clinton is absolutely brilliant. It has to do with simply political will and ability. Clinton will endure anything. He will force his family to endure anything. He will say anything, and he will do it convincingly, whether it's true or not, to get past the obstacle. And that is to be. I mean, look, that's admirable. I've written about him very admirably over the years. But it leads me back to the question I asked before, which is how we changed the definition of political skill and political leadership in that moment, and whether the country, in Hart's words, in 1987, ends up getting something closer to the leaders it deserves.
But look, Clinton also took the correct lesson from the mountain lion. He didn't run.
Yeah, I wanted to battling through that. Clinton's ability to battle through that, his character. This guy's character also.
It does.
Bill Clinton's unique. Very few. I remember once when there was a program called Washington Weekly Review, and I remember one of the columnists saying about Bill Clinton at the time, and this was about the Jennifer Flowers scandal. He he said the public will accept more from Bill Clinton than they would from your average politician.
Sure. And I think it does. Maybe that kind of perseverance does reflect a kind of character. It certainly reflects a necessary political skill. All I would argue is, when we talk about Clinton as the greatest politician of his age, what are we almost universally talking about? We're not talking about the vision, which, by the way, I think is undersold and undercredited. What we're talking about is the ability to survive. The greatest biography of the Clinton presidency is not called The Reformer, it's called The Survivor. And he spent 8 years surviving both scandals of his own making and made up stupid scandals that nobody remembers, like Travelgate, whatever that was. So you know, I think Clinton's ascension actually does not disprove the idea that there was a fundamental shift in the middle 1980s. It actually confirms the fact and is actually a powerful testament to it.
We are unfortunately out of time for the evening. I'd like to extend a warm thanks to both Matt and to Senator Kerrey for joining us this evening.